Around AD 48, the Apostle Paul sat down to write one of the most urgent letters in the New Testament. The churches of Galatia were being pulled away from the gospel he had preached to them, and Paul's response was not gentle correction, it was a curse, a real one, invoked twice for emphasis. In the Bible, Paul writes, "But even if we, or an angel from heaven, preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone preaches any other gospel to you than what you have received, let him be accursed." Galatians 1 verse 8 and 9. Paul warns against false teachers. He named the most authoritative possible source of a counterfeit message, an angel from heaven, and pronounced judgment on him in advance. At the time, this must have sounded almost hypothetical. What angel would ever show up centuries later, claiming heavenly authority, delivering a message that overturned the very heart of Paul's gospel? Roughly 550 years after Paul wrote those words, Islamic tradition says exactly that happened. According to the Hadith literature, which is the authoritative accounts of Muhammad's life compiled by later generations of Muslims, Muhammad received his first revelation around AD 610 in the Cave of Hira, on a mountain outside Mecca. The being who appeared to him is identified as the angel Jibril, the Arabic name for Gabriel. That encounter marked the beginning of the revelations that would become the Quran. What makes this striking isn't simply that an angel appeared, it's the content of the message that followed. The revelation attributed to the cave produced a theology that directly contradicts the gospel Paul described as having received and preached. We know that Islam contradicts Christianity, but do you know that the Bible mentions them indirectly in Revelations? Subscribe to our Bible Verses Explained channel and be the first to know when that video drops. Let's look at the major contradictions. Number 1. The Crucifixion. Paul's gospel is built on the death and resurrection of Christ, a message he calls of first importance, that Christ died for sin, was buried, and rose again on the third day, all according to the scriptures. 1 Corinthians 15 verse 3 and 4. The Quran, in contrast, denies that Jesus was actually crucified, teaching that it only appeared so. Number 2. The Deity of Christ. Paul opens nearly every letter identifying Jesus as Lord in the fullest sense, worthy of worship alongside the Father. Islamic theology insists on strict, undivided monotheism tawhid and treats any claim of Christ's divinity as a serious theological error. Number 3. The Trinity. The gospel Paul preached assumes a triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit, active together in salvation, as reflected in his benediction wishing the grace of Christ, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit on his readers. 2 Corinthians 13 verse 14. The message from the cave explicitly rejects this framework. In other words, if the Hadith accounts are taken at face value, what emerged from that cave was not a minor variation on Paul's gospel. It was, point for point, a gospel contrary to the one Paul preached and delivered, according to the tradition itself, by an angel. Skeptics will point out, fairly, that Paul wasn't naming Muhammad and had no cave in mind when he wrote to the Galatians. That's true, and it's worth being honest about. Paul's immediate concern was the Judaizing teachers troubling the Galatian churches, not a prophecy about a religion that wouldn't exist for over 5 centuries. But that's precisely what makes the pattern worth noticing rather than dismissing. Paul wasn't writing a narrow rebuke aimed at one group in one city. He reached for the most extreme, hardest to imagine scenario he could think of, a heavenly messenger overturning the gospel of Christ, specifically to close every loophole in advance. He was in effect saying, it doesn't matter how impressive or authoritative the source is. If the message contradicts what has been delivered, it is false, full stop. That is exactly the test history handed back to the church centuries later. A new religious movement arose, tracing its founding revelation to an angelic encounter in a cave, teaching a message about God, Christ, and salvation that stands in direct opposition to Paul's gospel. Whether or not Paul could have foreseen the specific circumstances, the principle he laid down fits the situation with uncanny precision, as if the criterion had been built for exactly this test. What gives Galatians 1 verse 8 its lasting force is that Paul didn't tie the curse to a particular teacher or a particular era. He tied it to the content of the message, regardless of who delivers it or how convincingly. That's what makes the verse durable rather than a one-time warning that expired with the Galatian controversy of the first century. It also means the test cuts both ways, and Paul knew it. He applies it first to himself before he applies it to any angel. The gospel is the fixed point. Every messenger, however exalted, is measured against it. Seen in that light, the parallel between Galatians 1 verse 8 and the account of the Cave of Hira isn't a forced or superficial connection. An angel, a cave. A message that inverts the cross, the Trinity, and the deity of Christ. Paul wrote the test 5.5 centuries before history is said to have handed him a candidate for it, and the candidate fits.